Today is day one of 2 days of a public workshop to receive information regarding ecosystem changes and the low salinity zone. Day two will be tomorrow, held tomorrow. This workshop is part of Phase 2 of the State Water Board's review of the 2006 Water Quality Control Plan for the Bay Delta Estuary. Phase 1, which is still ongoing, addresses San Joaquin River flows and southern Delta water quality issues. Phase 2 addresses potential modifications to the remainder of the Bay Delta Plan and focuses on fish and wildlife beneficial uses. I am clearly not Charlie Hoppin. Charlie will not be here today or tomorrow. I am Fran Spivey-Weber, Vice Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. And with me today, right this moment, are Stephen Moore and Felicia Marcus. Tam will be joining us within 5 or 10 minutes. Also present, we have, let's see where, okay, we have Rich Satowski, Senior Engineer, Diane Riddle, Environmental Program Manager, Erin Mahaney, Staff Counsel, and Dr. Brock Bernstein, subcontractor for ICF International, who will be the workshop facilitator. So if you're looking for guidance from me, don't look up here, look over at Brock. Before we get started, a few words about evacuation. Please look around now and identify the exits closest to you. In the event of a fire alarm, we're required to evacuate this room immediately. Take your valuables with you. And here comes Tam Dodo. Exit down the stairway and go to our relocation site across the street in Cesar Chavez Park. Also, please turn off all cell phones, beepers, etc., etc., etc. This workshop is being held in accordance with public notice dated June 22nd, 2012, and revised on August 15, 2012. This is an informal workshop. The State Board will not take any formal action today or tomorrow, and there will be no sworn testimony or cross-examination of participants. However, the State Water Board and its staff do plan on asking questions of the panelists. There is no court reporter present today. We are, however, broadcasting this workshop on the internet and preparing an audio and video recording. So please be sure that you identify yourself clearly and speak into the microphone. First, we'll have a short introduction from staff and Dr. Bernstein. Then we'll hear from the various panels today and tomorrow. After all the panels are over tomorrow, we'll hear comments from the public. However, if you intend to speak tomorrow as a public participant, please fill out a blue speaker card today. You can also fill it out tomorrow and give it to our staff. If you're not sure whether you wish to speak, fill out a card and mark it if necessary. In order to assure that all participants have an opportunity to participate, comments will be limited to 5 minutes per speaker. To avoid repetition, and in the interest of time, if there are groups of you with the same comments, please pick a spokesperson to present your combined comments. We also have sign-up sheets at the back of the room. Signing in, of course, is voluntary, and but it will ensure that you receive notice of any future actions that the State Water Board may take concerning this topic. If you provide your email address, we will add you to our Bay Delta Notices LIRIS subscription list. This is a hot topic. You will absolutely want to be on that list. It's very important. You can unsubscribe, however, at any time should you get bored. If you have already signed up for this LIRIS email subscription list, you do not need to provide your email. Now I will turn the program over to Rich Satowski, who will make a brief presentation, and you will introduce the rest of the day. Thank you.
Good morning, Vice Chair Spivey Weber and members of the board. I'm Rich Sitkowski, an engineer, senior engineer with the Division of Water Rights. And with me is Diane Riddle, environmental program manager over Bay Delta, and also Aaron Mahaney, staff counsel. I'll provide some background related to the State Water Board's Bay Delta planning activities and these workshops and next steps for the comprehensive Phase 2 review of the process for the Bay Delta. And then I'll turn it over to Brock, who will provide an overview for the next 2 days. As has been discussed in other workshops and meetings, the planning effort for updating the Bay Delta plan is distributed into 4 phases. The first phase is the San Joaquin River flow and South Delta water quality phase. And this deals with objectives for the protection of fish and wildlife beneficial uses, and for Southern Delta water quality objectives, and the associated program implementation. The State Water Board staff anticipates releasing a draft environmental document in support of Phase 1 in the next month or so, with a workshop in late fall or early winter. Phase 2, which is the subject of today's workshop, includes the comprehensive review and update of the Bay Delta plan focused on fish and wildlife beneficial uses, not including the San Joaquin River flows, which are part of Phase 1. I will speak to the next steps for this phase later. And then Phase 3, as shown on the slide here, includes modification to water rights and other requirements needed to implement changes to the Bay Delta plans for Phases 1 and 2. This phase will commence following completion of the Phases 1 and 2. And finally, Phase 4 includes development and implementation of flow requirements for priority delta tributaries. This work will proceed on various timelines for different priority tributaries. To assist the board in gathering and assessing the technical and scientific information related to the comprehensive review of the Bay Delta plan, the State Board scheduled a series of workshops. The State Board issued a save the date notice on April 24, 2012, followed by a regular notice on June 22, 2012. And then we had a amended notice, a revised notice on August 16, 2012. As mentioned, the first of these 3 workshops is the ecosystem changes in the low salinity zone workshop. The next workshop in October will focus on scientific and technical information related to Bay Delta fisheries. And then the last workshop will deal with the analytical tools for evaluating water supply, hydrodynamics, and hydropower effects. So pursuant to the public notice, the specific topics for today include the effects of the low salinity zone on estuarine species, the interaction of salinity with non-flow related factors, and then the identification of modeling or other tools to measure and protect the estuarine habitat. Since the State Water Board recently gathered and received a large amount of scientific material related to the workshop topics during the 2009 periodic review of the Bay Delta plan, and then the 2010 Delta flow criteria proceedings, in the notice, the State Board specifically requested information that was not addressed in those 2 proceedings. As discussed in the notice, the Delta flow criteria report suggests the flows that would be needed in the Delta ecosystem if fishery protection was the sole purpose for which its waters were put to beneficial use. The report did not consider any balancing of public trust resource protection with public interest needs for water. As part of its update of the 2006 Bay Delta plan, the State Water Board will consider other public interest needs for water, including municipal, industrial, agricultural, power, and recreational uses. So the questions outlined in the notice include the following. What additional scientific and technical information should the State Water Board consider to inform potential changes to the Bay Delta plan relating to the ecosystem changes and the low salinity zone that was not addressed in the 2009 periodic review and the 2010 Delta flows criteria report? What is the level of scientific certainty or uncertainty regarding that information? Third, what changes to the Bay Delta plan should the State Water Board consider based on information in order to address existing circumstances and changing circumstances such as climate change and the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, BDCP. And then how should the State Water Board address scientific uncertainty and changing circumstances, including climate change, invasive species, and other issues? And then finally, what kind of adaptive management and collaboration, monitoring and special studies programs should the State Water Board consider related to the ecosystem changes and the low salinity zone as part of the update to the Bay Delta Plan? We received 13 written summaries and more than 500 additional documents and other materials from the commenters listed on the slide up on the screen here. All these materials have been shared with the workshop participants. All the summaries have also been posted on the State Board's website, and we're in the process of posting the additional 500 plus set of materials. And then finally, this slide shows the anticipated timeline for the Phase 2 comprehensive review of the Bay Delta Plan. We have the next 2 workshops shown on here in October and November. And then after the technical workshops, Dr. Bernstein will develop a draft summary report on the workshop's key points, the areas of agreement and disagreement, and sources of disagreement, and then the degree of certainty. Once the draft report is released, participants will have an opportunity to comment on the report before it is final. And after the report is final, Dr. Bernstein will present the summary report to the board. Then based on the information received at the workshops and other sources, the State Board staff will develop a technical basis report outlining the scientific basis for the proposed modifications of the plan. The scientific report will be part of the staff report and environmental document prepared in support of the potential changes to the Bay Delta Plan. The scientific basis report is planned to be released in the winter of 2013, and the draft environmental document is targeted for release in the fall of 2013. Final consideration of adoption of any changes to the Bay Delta Plan by the State Water Board is planned by the summer of 2014. This concludes my presentation. Diane Riddle and I are available for any questions you have, and if there are no questions, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bernstein.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is just make a couple of comments, excuse me, about how the day will go, and sort of ask for your cooperation in a few things that'll make it go more smoothly. So first of all, you guys I know are all pros, but each microphone has, and for any speakers who come up, each microphone has a little button to turn on when you talk and turn it off when you're not talking, because it'll interfere with the recording, right? Secondly, in front of me here is a timer. Each panel has 85 minutes of presentation time, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A time. So I know a lot of you have done a lot of dry runs, and I know that you're well within your time limits, but just keep an eye on this. I obviously can't see it, but keep your eye on it, and the board staff over there will start making all sorts of extreme movements if you're out of time. So in terms of I know this is your guys' workshop, and you want to make sure you get everything you can out of these presentations. And at the same time, we want to make sure that everyone gets the material presented to you in a timely manner, and we stay on track. So what I'd ask you is, if somebody says something that really doesn't make any sense, and you need to ask a question at that point for clarification, just let me know, and I'll break in for you. On the other hand, if it's a more substantive question, especially one that might cut across a couple of the people who are presenting in that panel, if you could save that to the end, I think the Q&A process would actually give you more of what you want. So having said that, I guess we're ready to get going. So if you could start the timer, and Peter, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bernstein, and good morning, Vice Chair Spivey Weber and members of the board. I'd just like to give a little perspective about how this first panel came about. We were approached a few weeks ago by members of your board staff and with Dr. Bernstein, asking us if we could convene a panel at the start of each workshop with some very specific directions. So what we were asked to do is to put together a panel that looks at what's new since 2010, when you had a fairly detailed report presented that was a result of many months of effort by a group of scientists. And what we've done is, with these panels, we've asked the panel members to speak on behalf of science to the maximum extent possible. You're going to be hearing from agencies and other folks throughout these workshops. So from the Delta Science Program perspective, we spent a lot of time in selecting the panel members. We wanted the panel members to be interdisciplinary, to cover all of the areas for the questions which come up. Secondly, we wanted to represent the different study groups that are out there doing science on the Bay Delta. Different groups are focusing on different areas, and we wanted that to be captured. And I would just like to emphasize the direction that we got from Dr. Bernstein and from staff, that we've asked them to highlight uncertainty and where areas of legitimate scientific disagreement lie. And of course, in the science program, we're very interested in that because that's where we want to encourage and target future research. We also said that the panels don't have to agree. It's quite okay if there's a disagreement. It doesn't need to be a uniform message. And most importantly, we've asked them to think about the information that they felt that you as the board really needed to know from the science perspective as you're making decisions. So those 5 questions were very well crafted, but if the panel wished it to go beyond that, we said that was quite okay. So it's a great privilege to introduce the various members of the panel. You have their names in front of you. Larry Brown is with the USGS in the Sacramento office. Jim Klern is with the USGS in Menlo Park. Steve Culberson is with the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Cliff Dahm is the former lead scientist. He held my position. He's also a distinguished professor at the University of New Mexico. Bill Fleener is here from the University of California, Davis. Wim Kemmerer is from the Romberg-Tiburon Center for Environmental Studies. And Anka Muller-Solger is the lead scientist for the IEP program. Sorry. And most importantly,
And Bruce's chop.
thanks to my colleagues at the other end.
And Bruce's chopped liver, right?
Bruce Harbold, of course, with the EPA. My apologies, Bruce. So what we tried to do, too, here is to build on the March 2010 report. And this slide just shows the scientists who spent many months discussing the report which came out. And what we tried to do with this panel is to have some overlap with these 3 workshops with those discussions that went on, so information wasn't lost. But at the same time, we wanted to bring other scientists into the group to expand on that, particularly where they had expertise. I would also really like to acknowledge the work of first of all, here are the 5 key points that came out of that report. And I think you'll be hearing about this. First of all, environmental flows are more than just volumes of inflows and outflows. There's a huge scientific body of literature that knows it's not just the volume. The timing of the flows, as you very well know, are critical, but also the variability, the natural variability in the system can also provide significant benefits, and we're beginning to understand a lot more about that. Secondly, they pointed out that recent flow regimes after over the past few decades have had or have induced harm to both native species and in some cases have encouraged non-native species to proliferate. The third point was that flow is that's important, is a major determinant of habitat and transport. And fourthly, the recent environmental flows which were established were not sufficient to support the native delta fishes. And finally, as you might expect from scientists, the importance of continuing a strong science program with flexible management regime is going to be very important to understanding this very, very complex system. And so I would just like to acknowledge the panel. This happened at very short notice during the vacation season. The panel have really put a lot of effort. They've set aside other things because they recognize the importance of the work that faces you. And there's been numerous discussions and thoughts about just how to craft this message. So I'd like to thank the panel for that. This is my final slide. I would just like to give an overview of what you can expect in the next few minutes. Dr. Flina is going to start out by giving you an overview of the hydrologic changes in the system, particularly in light of some of the new modeling, the new understanding within the system. And then Dr. Kemmerer will talk about changes within the ecosystem and what we're beginning to learn for the low salinity zone. And Dr. Klein will follow that, getting to the point that you asked about managing the estuary for an uncertain future. There's a lot of unknowns, as you'll hear about, coming at the system. And I believe Anke Müller-Solger will speak on behalf of her and Larry Brown to talk about some of the changing science, how things are getting done. And Dr. Dahm then has the unenviable task of summarizing what's been done and this particular panel's recommendation. So if you have no questions for me, I will pass it on to Dr. Flina.
Good morning. I've had the opportunity, as Peter said, to speak to the board in the past about a lot of flow changes and needs in the Delta. Today I'd like to broaden that somewhat and get into some of the extensive changes we made in the Delta as far as physical and other habitat are concerned, and how that affects, how we've modified flows overall, and how that affects water quality and the ecosystem. Okay, I guess I should have put this slide up first. That I talk about consumptive use, inflow decreases, and outflow, as well as water quality degradation. There's a new must-read on habitat in the Delta that's just been recently released by the San Francisco Estuary Institute on Delta Historical Ecological Investigation. They've done a great job, primarily led by Allison Whipple and Robin Grossinger, and have put together from historical documents a tremendous pre-European ecology view of the Delta, focusing primarily on mapping the Delta early 1800s, pre-development. They didn't limit themselves to a legal delta. They considered everything below a 25-foot elevation, and that takes in approximately nearly 800,000 acres, and of course includes Sassoon Bay and Marsh in that study. It does a more rigorous view of some of the past work from people like Thompson in 1957, and of course they have much better access to some of these documents that now a lot of historical documents have been put online. They also had tools not available to people in the past, such as GIS and what have you. They've identified over 394,000 acres of open water and wetlands that existed in the Delta, and you can see that on the left panel in the shaded area. At the same time, there was an additional 124,000 plus acres that were inundated every year. And to the extent to where it created ponded situations and elevated water tables that would support like vegetation of this type of an area. Additionally, another 144,000 were seasonally flooded, but for less time, fewer years, and at elevations that wouldn't support all the vegetation and the habitat of the other. Clearly, regardless of the characteristics of the flows of that time, which have always been highly variable, there was always extensive habitat of all types, particularly low salinity zone, and gradients to connect them to other types of habitat. Their work, this is kind of a summary slide of their work. They identified 3 different regions, as you can see on the left, designated by the green, the blue, and the orange. And the pie charts themselves indicate an extensive mosaic of habitats, but at the same time, each of those 3 habitats has distinct identification. The northern area being seasonal floodplains primarily, although it's, like I say, it still has other extensive habitat. The middle are emergent wetlands, and the bottom is kind of a distributary system. I've shown a lot of flow and timing in the past at some of these board hearings, but this is a slide, and I've kind of even extended by another year's data of a slide from Kemmerer and Jasby, demonstrating that long-term water availability really has not changed much since the extensive drought of the 20s and 30s. The total water available is actually fairly constant, although we recognize that you know, it's more rainfall today than snow as the past, and of course that snow is melting a little earlier now than it used to. So timing certainly has changed on that. I've also shown some of these data in the past, but I've tried to kind of simplify it a bit, looking at decadal values of consumptive use of water that comes to the delta. And here I've shown it basically since full development of the delta, basically 1930. You can see easily that upstream consumptive use has gradually increased, certainly quickly in the 30s with the advent of the growth of rice. Today, averaging nearly 9 million acre feet a year. In delta consumptive use in the rust color, looks almost orange here, is pretty constant. It doesn't really make, you know, you have a fixed amount of acreage. Irrigation patterns haven't changed too much in that period of time. So it's pretty constant. It varies a little bit from water year to water year type. Export pumping, of course, which began then in the early 50s, has increased substantially and excuse me, has increased to over an average of over 6 million acre feet a year in some recent decades. And of course, this year we had a record exceeding 6.5 million acre feet. In this slide, I've used day flow data, which are daily data into the delta, compared to unimpaired flow, which would be kind of a natural available type of water system, although it's not totally natural in its timing, and to look at monthly deficits of flow. And here the San Joaquin River is in rust color, the Sacramento River is in a bluish color. And we can see that we've significantly depleted some of the inflows to the delta, but of course, and the timing of that differs from river to river, because the San Joaquin typically melts later because of its higher elevation, so that's later in the spring and early summer. Of course, that doesn't tell the whole story within the delta, and this is another extension of some work by Kemmerer and Jasby, recent work where I was able to add in an extra year, showing the trends in exports and outflow from the delta. The red bars in this case show statistical significance. And we can see that exports have trended as an increase in every month except May throughout this period of 1956 through 2011. It started slightly after exports were begun. And outflow has statistically significantly decreased in the fall and early winter when a period of concern for the low salinity zone. At the same time, water quality, as we understand, of course, as we consume water upstream, a lot of the water that we haven't consumed is returned from ag draining. So we have impaired the inflows somewhat, do we understand? And of course, the San Joaquin River is much more impaired than the Sacramento, so the water quality in the San Joaquin is even worse. But what I've shown here is a comparison of 2 different years. 2006 was wet, 2009, which is dry, and the light color is the delta ag drainage contribution, and the dark part of the bar is the wastewater contribution of delta inflows. So even on a monthly average, and only monthly average data are really available right now for ag returns, Even on a monthly average, you can see that in fall months, of concern again that up to 15% of inflows in a dry year are coming from wastewater treatment and ag drainage within the Delta. Some other recent work that I have a student doing right now is trying to examine Delta ag drainage on a daily basis, and it's pretty clear that the daily basis would be much higher than 15%. So basically, the messages that I'm trying to present here is the fact that you know, we've impaired about 97% of the habitat within the Delta. Upstream consumptive use has continued to increase and to where we've kind of hit a plateau in the last 20 years, and obviously the more we try to maximize that, the less reliable supplies really become. Upstream use has greatly modified inflow into the Delta, and obviously at the bottom left we have decreased fall outflows, and while we've increased exports in every month. And the declining water quality is going to continue to decline. We're certainly probably not going to be any worse with ag drainage, but within the Delta, but obviously wastewater treatment effluent is going to increase as population increases. And I thank you.
Actually, thank you. Not a question, but more of a comment for those who are standing in the back of the room. As Mr. Johns has discovered, there are some seats up here in the front row. And if you rush up, there's even a free seat right next to Mr. O'Loughlin.
Raise your hand.
Wait, no, I've sat next to Tim. He's a pleasant company, so please come on up and make yourself comfortable.
Good morning. I'm Wim Kemmerer with the Romberg. What's so funny about that? No. Yeah, I'm Wim Kemmerer from the Romberg Tiburon Center, San Francisco State University, and my topic is following on to Bill's. Okay, so what are the changes and what does the variability in flows imply for the ecosystem, and for specifically focusing on the low salinity zone, but not exclusively. And I'll explain why in a minute. So the first thing is, what do we mean by the low salinity zone? Where is it? How big? This is from a simulation model, UNTRIM, work done by Michael McWilliams, which is written down on the bottom, but you can't read it. I didn't make that color. And what you see there is a map of the system with color representing salinity, and then there's a bar across the delta indicating the location of the low salinity zone. So X2 is from the mouth of the estuary, the Golden Gate, up to that point. And so what you can see from this is kind of a low flow rate, and the flow is increasing in this case. And you can see that the low salinity zone is up in the delta. It's rather constrained in the channels. The low salinity zone, by the way, is the kind of blue color, and then freshwater is white, and then as you get into more green and yellow and red, that's more saline. So if we look at a different flow condition, this is with X2 at around 65 or so, or 68 kilometers, and that's sort of right in the middle of Sassoon Bay. Is where the low salinity zone is, and a couple things about this. You can see that it's up into the shallows of Grizzly and Honker Bays. And actually, the area of the low salinity zone has just about doubled, and the volume has also increased in relation to where it was when it was in the delta. You also probably notice that the flows aren't all that different between those two, and that's because X2 depends on today's flow and roughly the flow over the last couple of weeks. So when flow is increasing or decreasing, it has a huge effect on where X2 is in relation to flow. Notice also that as the low salinity zone moves, all the other isohalenes move. So you see the higher salinities pushing out into the Central Bay and into South Bay, which you can't see, and out into the ocean. And if you go take that a step further, you'll see that under extremely high flows, we get the low salinity zone expanding again into San Pablo Bay, and we get essentially low salinity throughout the estuary. So, so the point here is that as these isohalenes move, they change shape. The shape and size of the low salinity zone changes. But if you pick any other salinity zone, it will also change. And also notice that, of course, the area of fresh water throughout the estuary expands greatly as flow increases.
Question. Have you done or are you aware of a similar analysis using inflow?
It doesn't really matter if you use inflow or outflow. What we did for this particular analysis is we used historical inflow and export flow and outflow.
Okay.
We've also done similar analyses where we hold export flows constant and vary inflow to vary outflow. And we get pretty much the same result. At these high flows especially, exports are not a huge part of the equation. So what about the fish? So I'll harp on delta smelt here, but this applies to really any pelagic fish, meaning fish that live more or less in the water column. We think of their habitat as having two components. There's kind of a static geographic habitat, and then there's also a dynamic habitat. And in this case, for delta smelt in the summer and fall, that is the low salinity zone. So under high flow conditions, the dynamic habitat is down in Sassoon Bay, Grizzly Bay, Hunker Bay, and whereas the static habitat, the geographic range, is throughout the whole this whole region depicted in the light blue oval. Under low flow conditions, of course, that habitat moves up into the western delta, and where those habitats are probably has a lot to do with how the smelt do or how other fish do, and it has to do with the shape of the habitat, what it's next to, whether it's next to the shallows of Sassoon Bay and next to Sassoon Marsh, which is a fairly productive area, or whether it's up in the delta, which is more channelized and sort of sterile, and whether what other aspects of the static geographic habitat are adjacent to the moving habitat that the fish actually live in. So you have to sort of think of these animals and other pelagic organisms as living in a moving frame of reference rather than a fixed frame of reference. It makes it a little bit harder to understand what they're doing and how they're varying over time. We also need to recognize, in 2011, we had this unusual condition of high flow in the fall, and we had, as Anka will talk about a little bit later, we had a bump up in abundance of delta smelt in the fall. That's one data point, and we don't want to hang our hats on anything like that, but we have to keep an eye on changes like that, but most important, keep an eye on the underlying mechanisms, how the system is working to make things like that happen. And Anka will again talk about that quite a lot. Now, as the low salinity zone moves, the depiction I showed you in the first slide was a daily average depiction. And that's not the whole story because we know there's tides. The bottom picture there shows rather crudely the movement of particles in a particle tracking model based on that same hydrodynamic model, the untrim. And the particles the particle in green here went back and forth between Carquinez Strait and the Western Delta, roughly Chips Island, over the time course of a month. And during that time, it made numerous excursions into all three of the main channels in Sassoon Bay, up into Grizzly Bay a little bit. And what you can see from this is a couple things. One is that this is part of that dynamism of that habitat, because hydrodynamic conditions are very different down here than they are up here. And also, the fact that the particles move around and go to different places as they move means that the water's not just sloshing back and forth, it's mixing very intensely. And the mixing part of it is very important to understanding how the system is working. So the low salinity zone we've known for a while is a key region for some species. And one of the sort of key factors about it is turbidity. We know that delta smelt and some other species are really turbidity is an important part of their habitat. We don't quite understand exactly how. We know it has to do with their feeding. Probably predator avoidance is a big part of that. But so how does turbidity respond to salinity and to flow? So this kind of band up through here is the low salinity zone. So this is a plot of salinity at a bunch of different variables. At the top we have light extinction, which is a kind of a turbidity measure based on I forget how many tens of thousands of Secchi depth readings. This is a little white disk that you lower into the water and measure how far it goes before you can't see it anymore. Rather crude measure, but we've got lots and lots of measurements of it, so it's a very handy measure. And I just fitted a curve to these things. I don't want to go into the details of that. But what you see here is the top line is under a very low X2 or high flow condition, and that's the light extinction as a function of salinity. So what you see is that the highest light extinction is right in the low salinity zone. So the low salinity zone is a turbidity maximum especially under high flow conditions. And then what you see is as X2 increases or flow decreases, you see that sort of advantage, that turbidity maximum in the low salinity zone starts to go away. We understand the reasons for that. It has to do with the complex hydrodynamics of the system, but the main point is fairly clear that there is a turbidity maximum there, and it's really dependent on flow. The second panel down shows the abundance indice, or abundance values rather, of a couple of key species, delta smelt in the heavy line and striped bass in the dotted line, dashed line, and the two colors are for summer and fall. The yellow is summer and the orange is fall. So they're both essentially low salinity zone residents. We know there's a population of delta smelt that spends its summer up in the Cache Slough complex, but apart from that, most of them are in the low salinity zone, and the same is true with striped bass. In fact, the two, in the fall, the two lines overlie each other. Notice also that there's some leakage out of the low salinity zone, both to low and high salinity. The second one down is mysid shrimp, and this also shows affinity to the low salinity zone. Mysid shrimp are more abundant there than they are elsewhere, but again, there's leakage out in both directions. And finally, we have three species of copepods. I don't even want to mention their names. One's a low salinity zone resident in red, and the other two are really freshwater residents that leak into the low salinity zone, and a kind of moderate salinity resident that also leaks into the low salinity zone. So the point here is that we have a variety of species that live in that region, and a variety of species that live in other salinity regions. They all seem to cue to salinity. It probably has very little to do with salinity tolerance proper. It has more to do with the interaction of behavior and hydrodynamics. But the main point is that the low salinity zone is key for some species, but that other salinity regions are also key for some species. So here is the X2 abundance index relationship for a longfin smelt. I've picked longfin smelt because it has the strongest relationship to X2 or flow, depending on your religion. And again, these colors have been changed a little bit, but the green is pre-clam, pre-1987. The yellow is post-clam, and the orange is post-pod. So there are sort of three periods of time during which the relationship of longfin smelt abundance to X2 was pretty strong and pretty constant. Notice that the slopes didn't change, but the intercepts did. In other words, there's been sort of a ratcheting down of the abundance of longfin smelt in relation to their flow pattern, their flow relationship, but that relationship itself hasn't really changed. So I wanted to make a couple of points about that. One is that ratcheting down we think probably has to do with food supply, especially the first one, because I'll show you in a little bit, we have a good handle on some of the mechanisms for that. But the other thing is that I want to make the distinction between X2, the index of the response, the physical response of the estuary to flow, and the actual low salinity zone itself. Even though X2 sort of indexes the position of the low salinity zone, the two are rather different conceptually. And so down here, I've got the relative frequency of occurrence of longfin smelt in the Bay Study otter trawl, which is a bottom trawl, or near bottom trawl. And here, this is plotted against salinity and year, and the white lines enclose the low salinity zone, and the red is the region where they're catching the most, or getting the highest frequency for that year, in what salinity they're getting the highest frequency of occurrence in the net hauls. And so what you see is, first of all, that that this region is not in the low salinity zone. It's up around 10, 15 in the early years, and it actually sort of migrates out to 15 to 20 in the later years, and there's even this patch of high relative abundance in really high salinity. And so the point here is that even though longfin smelt have a strong relationship to X2, it has nothing to do with what's, as far as we can tell, with what's going on in the low salinity zone itself. It's at least on the face of it, it doesn't appear to be a mechanism that involves the low salinity zone. So the mechanisms behind these X2 abundance relationships may have to do with things very far from there. For example, couple of other examples, starry flounder and bay shrimp come into the bay from the ocean as young, and their abundance relationships to flow are quite strong, or to X2, and they're probably something to do with their entrainment into the estuary under high flow conditions. So, and then American shad, which lives in freshwater, has a moderately strong relationship to X2. It probably has something to do with its freshwater habitat instead. So I just wanted to reinforce the idea that correlations don't necessarily carry with them the understanding of the cause. I think you already know that, but it's worth emphasizing again and again, because we'll probably see, you'll probably go crazy with correlations over the next couple of days, including my talk. So we have, I don't know if you can see this. It's kind of hard to see with the colors, but anyway, this is a series of long-term trends of various things in the estuary that I'm going to talk about a little bit here. So at the top we have the grazing by Potamacorbula amurensis in the low salinity zone, and this is not abundance, it's actually estimated grazing rate within the low salinity zone. There's a ton of work and a ton of manipulation of data behind this. If I were to plot just the abundance of the clams or the biomass of the clams, it would be kind of similar. The main point is that since their introduction in '86 and their sort of appearance on the grand stage in '87, they've been abundant almost every year since, and well, extremely abundant, and their grazing rate has been very high, especially in summer to fall of every year since. Now, this is the fraction of the low salinity zone that's grazed by the clams per day, and this is taking into account the depth distribution, the inefficiency of grazing on small cells by the clams, and a bunch of bottom boundary layers, a bunch of other things. So, so we've done a lot of work to make this right, and so you can actually scale this to the expected growth rate of the phytoplankton, which typically in the low salinity zone, whoops, I made a mistake here, previous. With respect to the growth rate of phytoplankton at this time in the low salinity zone, this is considerably higher, and that's not even taking into account other kinds of grazing on phytoplankton. So, so going down to the phytoplankton, this is chlorophyll, a measure of phytoplankton biomass, and you can see, you've seen this a million times, peaks every summer except during the drought of '76-77, which was also attributed to grazing by clams and other clams. And then since '87 rather, there have been really no summer-long biomass peaks. There's some occasional brief spring blooms, and that's about it. Now, it's tempting to look at these two, and well, obviously there were no Potamacorbula before this time. There were other clams around. It's tempting to look at this and infer a correlation, and we've done that, but we've also done the homework of figuring out, you know, what are the grazing rates, and can we really link these mathematically, and are there other explanations for this pattern? And indeed, people have come up with other explanations. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on between this period and this period. Among them, changes in flow, changes in exports, changes in climate, temperature, and also ammonium discharge into the estuary, which you'll hear about, I think, tomorrow. So with all these other things going on, it's kind of tricky to assert that we think we know what's happening there. And I'd make kind of a cautious assertion that I think we do know, based on the work that was done back then and the work that's been going on ever since, that yes, clam grazing by itself can explain almost all of that decline. But that doesn't mean it explains all the decline. So going down here to the next row, to copepods, we've got a little mystery here. So this is actually biomass of all the copepods in the low salinity zone, and the blue ones are mostly native species, and the red ones are mostly introduced species. And what's kind of odd to me, or was odd to me, is that the decline in copepods wasn't anything like the decline in phytoplankton or the decline in mysids down here. Mysids really collapsed. There have been several introductions of mysids as well. This is total mysid biomass. So why did the mysids collapse and not the copepods? Well, I'm going to jump down here to the anchovies, because one of the things that happened is the anchovies bailed from the low salinity zone. This is actually the ratio of abundance in the low salinity zone to what's in high salinity, because in high salinity, the anchovies are always really abundant. In the low salinity zone, they used to be sort of about, I think about half of the biomass of fish in that region, of small fish. And now they're 10, 20%. And what seems to have happened is not that they died or anything, just that they left. They didn't like the environment anymore. The food environment for them was just not suitable, and they left. So what that did was it kind of freed up, it removed a source of predation on small animals like copepods. And I think what happened was then these copepods, which are either very small or they have a refuge in fresh water, were able to sort of hang on in the low salinity zone. So then the other thing that happened is that longfin smelt abundance collapsed. I showed you that before. It went down quite a lot. Then in the early 2000s, it went down again, and for reasons that I'm not quite sure we actually know very well. So then with all that going on, how does the low salinity zone even get by? How is it that you catch any fish in there at all? And part of the reason for that is essentially leakage from other parts of the estuary. So here we have salinity and chlorophyll. This is one example. This is from July to August 2010, and this is actually taken out of a plot that shows this for the entire period of record, which is 75 to 2010. And pretty much the whole post-clam period, you see this pattern where within the low salinity zone, the chlorophyll biomass of phytoplankton is lower than it is in freshwater, the nearby freshwater, and lower than it is in the more brackish and saline water downstream. Well, so that implies to me two things. One is that something in here is doing away with the phytoplankton. And the other thing is, well, I talked about mixing earlier. We have mixing between these regions. We also had advection or net flow due to the rivers coming downstream. And both of these will bring phytoplankton biomass from the freshwater. Advection will bring phytoplankton from the freshwater into the low salinity zone, and mixing will bring phytoplankton in from both directions. And this will reseed the low salinity zone with phytoplankton and keep it sort of propped up. Without that, the chlorophyll, the biomass in here would really collapse to extremely low levels. We also see similar subsidies with regard to microzooplankton, which are the main food for the copepods. And by the way, we don't have any monitoring data on the microzooplankton for any time period. And also the copepods. There's a subsidy of some copepods from other regions. So without these subsidies, the low salinity zone would be even worse off than it is. Now, I'll talk about that. We've seen a lot of changes in the estuary, and I've talked about the changes due to clams, and Bill talked about the changes due to flow. We've also had other long-term changes, and we think that some of these may have to do with the sort of static flow conditions, particularly in summer and fall, that have become